Welcome back. You're watching The Heat. We're talking about the trilateral summit that was attended by the leaders of China, Japan, and the Republic of Korea, and the issues surrounding it. Let's get back to our panel right now. And Brian, I'm going to start with you for this part of the program as well. You've been to the DPRK several times. When you look at, as we just talked about a moment ago, how quickly things have moved. I mean, here we have two countries, the DPRK and the United States, who were on the verge of a confrontation not so long ago. What do you think was the thinking on the part of the leaders of the DPRK to enter into these negotiations so quickly?
Well, I think the DPRK has been very forthright about where they're going. If you looked at Kim Jong-un's speech on January 1st, 2017, he said we're in the final stages to do what we need to do to have a military deterrent, which has to do with nuclear technology and missile capability. At the beginning of 2018, he said we did it. This year, they detonated a hydrogen bomb. They had an ICBM. Who knows exactly how effective? But he said, now we've done it. And at the very same moment that he said we've accomplished our military needs, he reached out to South Korea, or reached back to South Korea, to Moon Jae-in, who immediately reciprocated. So I think the DPRK kind of understood that there was no other course. The American position of strategic patience was a colossal blunder, because DPRK used those 8 years to develop its nuclear technology and missile technology. I think it changed the relationship of forces in the way that they had sought.
And I guess the big difference now, Brian, is that the DPRK is negotiating from a position of strength, very different from the negotiations that Iran had to engage in with the United States.
Yeah, and the DPRK looks at Iraq. I mean, Saddam Hussein was disarming up until the moment he was invaded, and then he was executed. Libya agreed to give up its weapons of mass destruction and enter into economic agreements with the West. In 2011, NATO bombed Libya back to the Stone Ages almost. DPRK knows this. It's part of its informed understanding. It's a very sophisticated ruling party and a very sophisticated diplomacy. They're not giving up anything that would be fundamentally dangerous to the existence of the government.
Shinzo, China has pressed for the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. We've heard that many times from Chinese leaders. As these talks progress, what does China want?
I think China shared the goal with the United States, with Japan, with South Korea, even with North Korea, in a sense. That is, the Korean Peninsula should be a region, a place free of nuclear weapons. But of course, the real challenging part is how to achieve that goal. For North Korea, they have their security concern, and for the United States, they have their own concern. So is Japan and South Korea. So the real challenge is in the detailed arrangement, or in the detailed negotiation between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. I think, like the meetings between Kim and President Xi, basically 2 times in a short period of time of 40 days, shows like North Korea is in close communication with the Chinese side. They also need the backing of the Chinese side. I think North Korean government, the Kim is very smart. He's preparing for all options. Basically, of course, there's the option of reaching a deal with Donald Trump. There's also, a scenario of basically nothing will be achieved, and they will be again under severe pressure, not only economically but also militarily. They do need the Chinese backing. They do need the Chinese support. In the worst scenario, there's a military threat from the United States. What they are going to do?
Right. When you talk about Chinese support, Shinzo, if there is an agreement, if the DPRK agrees to get rid of its nuclear weapons, if there is denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, do you think Kim Jong-un and his country would look to China to be a guarantor of that kind of agreement, to prevent that country being suffering the same fate as Libya?
Well, we're not completely sure of that, but at least if there's acceptable, like a phased out, stage-by-stage arrangement with the U.S. side, for example, like providing a security assurance to both sides, step by step, and then that's achievable. And I'm not sure China will provide like a sweeping, blanket package of like a security guarantee, a guarantor for North Korea. But China obviously is standing side by side with North Korea. That is providing a sense of security here.
Myung-koo, so much has happened on the Korean Peninsula in recently. We had a meeting between Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in in the DMZ not so long ago, in which they raised the possibility of a permanent peace treaty between the two Koreas. Do you see that happening?
At least I can say that many South Korean people want such kind of, really optimistic future scenario. But I personally think I'm cautiously optimistic, but there are a lot of hurdles we need to, for instance, for the coming Trump and then Kim Jong-un summit meeting, it was, South Korean government suggests to have a meeting at Panmunjom, but the U.S. government didn't accept the offer and then moved to Singapore. And many South Korean people, wish to have, Panmunjom meeting between President Trump and then Kim Jong-un, and then President Moon Jae-in can join, trilateral meeting with Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, something like that. But as we know well, there are many issues, and we need to coordinate and solve among China, United States, North Korea, South Korea, and even including Russia and Japan as well. So ultimately, we should be cautious and prudent, but at the same time, it's compared to the last year's really, skyrocketing tensions. Of course, definitely, it's a quite promising, situation.
Kay, Chinese Premier Li's visit to Japan has been the first by a Chinese premier in 8 years. The relationship we know between these two countries has not always been good, but Premier Li sounded very upbeat. In fact, he was talking about there being a need for new progress in China-Japan ties. And the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has also sounded very positive about this. Let's listen to some of what Prime Minister Abe had to say.
There's nearly nothing left that is impossible if Japan and China can hold hands together. I'm confident that we can make greater contributions to resolving various regional and global issues.
So, Kay, what is your assessment of the China-Japan relationship today?
Certainly, as you mentioned, the relationship between China and Japan has not been much more than cordial in the last few years. And so this visit by Premier Li to Japan, especially in celebration also of the 40th year of normalization of relationship between China and Japan, is really an opportunity for the two countries to reaffirm their strong relationship, and to also for Prime Minister Abe to hedge his bets against the United States that has essentially given him a cold shoulder in recent weeks, and allow himself to remain on the global stage, the diplomatic stage that is, especially as these important meetings begin between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, to make sure that Japan is not isolated on the diplomatic stage, and to make sure that his goals of getting the abductee issue as well as the peace and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula, which includes the banning of short to mid-range missiles that could target Japan, to be placed on the table and when the negotiations occur.
You mentioned the abductee issue. Has that been discussed recently between Japan and the DPRK?
As far as I know, there has been no direct negotiations, but certainly Prime Minister Abe asked that Donald Trump bring this issue up when the Trump-Kim meetings occur in June. And even the trilateral meetings between Japan, Korea, and China, for the first time, the joint declaration mentioned the abductee issue as something that needs to be resolved between the DPRK and Japan. So this is a real feat for Prime Minister Abe, who has wanted this issue to be resolved under his watch.
Right. The abductee issue, of course, is about the Japanese nationals who were kidnapped by the DPRK and held in that country. Brian, I want to get back to the scheduled meeting between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. It's coming just after the DPRK, of course, released those 3 American prisoners. They're now back in the country. What did you make of that, the fact that they were released? Does it actually give the DPRK more leverage in these talks?
I think it does. I think that what the DPRK is doing is removing almost every obstacle that would be used pretextually by Trump or his advisors to not go forward with a normalization of relations or a deal. So the 3 Americans, they're released. The North Koreans also officially changed their position on whether American troops could remain in South Korea. Whether that's their actual position, I don't know. But they're removing step by step and obstacle by obstacle anything that Trump or his aides can point to and say, see, it's the obstinacy of the DPRK that's the problem. By removing those hurdles, removing those obstacles, then it's just Donald Trump. Donald Trump has to show what is he going to do in good faith. By the way, the American government, like all other nuclear powers, is also a signatory to the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, which means that they too must denuclearize. It's certainly something that the DPRK will remind others about, the fact that the whole world is supposed to denuclearize. That's the whole point of that treaty.
And in fact, in terms of when we talk about the denuclearization, it also would mean that U.S. nuclear-powered aircraft and ships cannot be in South Korea.
Yes, and it's very important because it was the United States that introduced nuclear weapons into the Korean Peninsula in 1958. And then maybe formally withdrew them later. But of course, the entire area of the Asia Pacific has American nuclear aircraft and nuclear submarines that have a tremendous payload. As Donald Trump said, the submarine is even more dangerous, the Trident submarine even more dangerous than the 3 aircraft carriers that he sent. Yes, this puts a big issue on the table. What about America's nuclear presence all around the region?
Shinzo, what's your view on these upcoming talks? What's the best case scenario there?
Well, the best case scenario, I would say, if there is a good start, if it can lay some foundation for further and future talks, that would be a success, I would say, because we cannot somehow expect this one summit will solve all the problem. It's time-consuming. There will be a lot of details to be dealt with by the two sides. It's about trust building, I would say. This is the first meeting between Kim and Donald Trump. If they agree upon something, that would be a great success.
Okay, and that's where we're going to have to leave it. That's it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks for being with us.